Malagos let out a snort of amusement as he watched the two newly born whelps fight in front of him, their tiny claws harmlessly swiping at each other. "You'll never get anywhere like that, young ones," Malagos wisely counseled. "Your teeth and claws are powerful tools, but they are far too undeveloped at your age. I recommend that you begin learning how to make use of your tails. It is an avenue of attack many never see coming." It was his experience that enemies always underestimated that amount of damage a dragon could do with a proper swipe of the tail. As his voice echoed through the creche, all activity ceased in an instant. Younglings haphazardly playing and ambling across the vast hall froze in place, their eyes wide and curious as they looked up at him. The azure illumination provided by the room's protective enchantments made it easy to make out the chaotic scene. Two whelps in the midst of a tug-of-war with a fray cloth froze as they looked up at him. Another group farther off paused their roaring contest, their shrill squeals momentarily replaced by silence. A few more, attempting to fly, crashed into their water bowls and made a mess that the resident draconid egg tender began to clean up. The one whelp that was harmlessly chewing on the end of his tail paused only for a moment before immediately continuing. Malagos ignored all of that and stared down at the whelps he had been watching with an expectant expression. He knew full well that the children of his flight began understanding Draconic earlier than any other flight. After a moment, one of the whelps turned to his sibling and clumsily attempted to smack their snout with his tail, only to trip over his own feet and land flat on his belly with a squeak of surprise. The other whelp didn't hesitate to take advantage of the opportunity and fiercely pounced on his fallen sibling, biting down on their snout. This seemed to serve as a signal for the rest of the creche as they immediately started moving about again. "Those two certainly have fire in their spirits, don't they, Lord Malagos?" Malagos turned his attention to the source of the amused voice and saw Kulkos in his mortal form, standing at the entrance to the creche. "I suppose they do," Malagos responded as he conjured the image of a whelp demonstrating a proper tail swipe. "But their form could certainly use some improvement. Even if our flight fights primarily with magic, it is still very important for them to understand the physical aspects of battle, especially in times like these." The illusion and the surge of arcane magic that accompanied the spell captured the attention of every youngling in the room. It wasn't long then before the entire creche was filled with whelps attempting to imitate the illusion's movements, their tiny tails whipping around with varying degrees of success. "If you'll forgive me for saying so, but I think the whelps can afford to be a bit clumsy at this stage," Kulkos interjected, a warm smile on his face. "With you here to protect them and guide our flight more than ever, I'm sure everything will be fine." Malagos dearly wished that was true. He and his siblings were among the most powerful entities on Azeroth, but Kulkos was not as well informed as he was about what lay ahead. If he was, the young dragon would have felt far less confident. Malagos couldn't help but study Kulkos closer as he recalled what the little prophet had told him about the blue dragonflight's future. In another timeline, it would have been this brat who would take his place as the aspect of magic. Seeing how he stared at the whelps with love and affection, Malagos could see how such a thing might happen. While Kulkos was not the most experienced or powerful member of his flight, he possessed a degree of loyalty to them and their duties that was impressive. Not only that, but the boy possessed an innate kindness that Malagos knew he had always lacked. Still, Malagos hoped that Kulkos would never be forced to shoulder the burdens of an aspect. After a few more peaceful moments of watching the whelps, Malagos sighed and decided that it was time to return to those burdens. "Why are you here, Kulkos? I recall giving instructions that I am not to be bothered while I am in the creche unless it is important." Kulkos straightened and pulled his gaze away from the whelps to look back at Malagos. "Forgive me, Lord Malagos, but Keeper Arkidas sent a message that he needs to speak with you in Udaman about one of his ongoing projects." Malagos hummed thoughtfully. That didn't narrow things down very much given that Arkidas was working on many projects, but there were only a few that involved Malagos directly. Considering that the matter was likely to be important, Malagos took a moment to shake off the whelps that were scampering across his back and gently removed the one gnawing on his tail. "Come with me, Kulkos," said Malagos as he made his way out of the creche. He didn't particularly need the younger dragon by his side, but it was important that he take the time to mentor Kulkos when the opportunity presented itself. After all, not even Nasdormu could perfectly predict what the future might bring. Kulkos jolted with surprise before hurrying to obey. Yes, Lord Malagos. The two of them passed through the wide halls of the Nexus until they reached its well-guarded portal room. Malagos ignored the bows and greetings of the Draconid portal guardians as he shifted to his mortal form and prepared to teleport himself and Kulkos to Udaman. One of the first things that Malagos had done after burying Syndragos's remains was enhance the defenses of the Nexus. Now not even he could easily bypass the wards that protected his flights home. It wasn't long before the two of them were hurled through space to the newly created portal hub of Udaman. A quick glance revealed that Archidas had begun fortifying his stronghold as well. Several stone golems with powerful fire enchantments etched into their arms were positioned all around the room, ready to unleash an inferno that would threaten most beings. Malagos paid them no mind as he left the portal room and began striding through the corridors of Udaman toward Archidas' former stasis chamber, which had been repurposed into a workshop. After a year of repairs, the differences between now and when the Titan facility was first rediscovered were quite obvious. The rubble had all been cleared by the many earthen who wandered the halls, and new structures, meticulously crafted and imbued with powerful magics, had replaced them. Even the air felt different, buzzing with arcane magic that carried the distinct flavor of overwhelming order and inflexibility that came with all Titan magic. All arcane magic was orderly, of course, but the Titans exemplified this more than any other. As he entered the final hallway that led to Archidas' workshop, Malagos couldn't help but note the surprising number of mortals who were walking the halls of Udaman. Nearly all of them were either dwarves or gnomes, scholars who had been allowed into this place so that they might learn what the Keeper was willing to teach them. It was surprising to him that Archidas was willing to share the secrets of the Makers even in this small capacity. The construct had shown a surprising amount of sentimentality when it came to his servants and their fleshy descendants. "This place is amazing, Lord Malagos, the wards are like nothing that I have ever seen," said Kulkos, his eyes distant as he sensed the powerful defenses Archidas had constructed. "It's almost like the entire structure has been enchanted. The modular nature of the spells is simply brilliant, and the energy pathways. They're so efficient. Even if the facility was cut off from the nearby ley line, these wards could last for centuries before falling." Malagos nodded in agreement. The Titans and their servants have always been particularly good at enchantments and creating stationary defenses. I have only been to Eldar a few times in my life, but the defenses there make these ones look pathetic in comparison. While Archidas had been the main craftsman among the keepers alongside Keeper Mamayan, he lacked many of the irreplaceable foundries that he would need to construct more impressive works. Kulkos looked as if he wished to say more, but he was interrupted as they finally arrived at the entrance to Archidas' workshop. The earthen guards were wise enough to immediately allow him passage instead of demanding that he verify his identity. The last few who wasted Malagos' time with such nonsense were teleported to the other side of the continent for their trouble. As they walked into the enormous workshop, they found Archidas and Ionaya working on a familiar device. It looked somewhat like a large basin carved out in the center of the room, with several carefully directed streams of magic flowing into it along pathways engraved in the wall. These streams were connected to a larger device that meticulously filtered and processed this raw energy into something more useful. "Malagos, I will be with you in one moment," said Archidas as he carefully studied the mixture of magic pooling within the basin in front of him. "I have made a few adjustments to the well of purification and would like to test this new mixture." Malagos truly wished that the Keeper had chosen a different name for his creation. He tried to avoid referring to any pool of magic as a well after what happened last time. "Very well, Keeper. I shall wait," Malagos generously allowed. He wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed being kept waiting, but he was curious to see if the well of purification would work as designed. Previous tests had been less than promising after all. "Lord Malagos, What is the Keeper's device supposed to do? Kulkoz asked curiously. It was created for the purpose of cleansing anything placed inside the well of even the most thorough void corruption, Malagos explained, keeping his eyes fixed on the pool of magic. It has been blessed by both Ysera and Alexstrasza, and uses arcane magic to intensify the purifying qualities of their magic to remove void corruption from entities that are beyond saving by any other method. I have been occasionally assisting Arkidas in its development for the past year. Kulkoz looked back at the object with newfound awe. Anything that had been created through the power of three aspects and a keeper was worthy of being looked at in such a way and studied. Satisfied with his inspection, Malagos watched as Arkidas waved his hand and telekinetically called to him a familiar weapon from the other side of the workshop. The enchanted blade that had spent millennia embedded in the body of the Cathrax that attacked Capital City was still steeped deeply in the void. The corruption wasn't as bad as it once was before Alexstrasza bathed it in her fire, but there was still a persistent corruption on the blade that refused to abate. Arkidas slowly lowered the weapon into the well and stepped back as the magic began to react. Green and red streams of magic reminiscent of Ysera and Alexstrasza met the shadowy essence of the void clinging to the blade and began to fight against it. The pool of magic turned into a twisting, bubbling mass of energy as the life and arcane magic tore into the void corruption. Gradually, the well of purification began to calm and Arkidas reached into it and retrieved the blade laying into the basin. Malagos immediately cast a diagnostic spell to search for any void corruption and was pleasantly surprised with the results. "Success," said Arkidas, his normally emotionless voice filled with satisfaction. "This configuration is far more effective than any of the previous prototypes. I will now move on to a living test subject. Would you please retrieve it, Ionaya?" The Titan Forged dipped her head before leaving the workshop. Nearly a minute later, she returned with a void-corrupted animal, a lizard of some kind, floating in a bubble of arcane magic behind her. Without any delay, Arkidas began his next experiment and dismissed the arcane barrier once it was floating above the well of purification. Malagos ignored the pained cries of the abomination and eagerly awaited the results. The display was much the same as it had been for the blade, and Arkidas retrieved the lizard the moment that the magical reaction began to calm. Malagos was initially excited as he began to examine the creature with a host of diagnostic spells, but soon cursed in disappointment. "It's only a partial success," Malagos announced with a scowl. "The creature's body has been cleansed of the void, but its soul and mind have been damaged as well." It was a bit of a disappointing outcome, but it was still obvious progress compared to their previous attempts. They were getting much closer. Arkidas frowned slightly before dismissing the matter and turned to face Malagos. The construct was no stranger to failed experiments, so he likely wouldn't dwell on it for long. "This endeavor has not been a complete success, but I have made some progress with the discs of Norgannon," Arkidas said as he walked over to the wall and activated a mechanism that caused a portion of the wall to disappear and reveal a hidden room. "It should now be possible for you to channel your scrying spells through the discs to access the sensor network responsible for updating its database." Malagos' eyes widened in surprise, and he grinned in excitement as he heard the Keeper's words. He hadn't expected that he would be able to make use of the discs so soon, and it couldn't have come at a better time. The discs of Norgannon were a set of enchanted artifacts created by the Keepers to record the ongoings of Azeroth. They were said to transcribe the full history of everything that ever happened in this world, but that was obviously nonsense. After all, why would the Keepers ever feel the need to know what a random Murloc ate 1,000 years ago? In reality, the discs of Norgannon was a repository of information directly attached to the Keepers' immense sensor and surveillance network. These sensors were enchanted with limited intelligence so that they could record any events that might be of interest to the Keepers and store that information in the discs. Even if the discs weren't actually omniscient, these sensors were powerful and pervasive enough to come close to truly seeing everything of significance on Azeroth. At least, they were that powerful in the past. Many of the sensors were damaged during the Sundering, and the old god's servants were able to destroy many of the rest without opposition after the Keepers lost control of Uldar. Loken, The fallen keeper had even managed to rescind security permission to access the largest sensors flying above Azeroth's skies and the sensors around the old god's prisons. Despite this, the remaining sensors would still form the most widespread surveillance network on Azeroth if Malygos was able to access them. Now that Archidas had reluctantly configured them to his magic, Malygos could look out for threats identified by the Little Prophet. "If the discs are prepared, then I intend to use them immediately," said Malygos as walked by the keeper. "Show me how to access them." Utterly unconcerned with Malygos' demanding attitude, Archidas taught him the proper spells to bypass the disc's security system. Soon, the entire room was filled with a vast array of floating images of different locations across Azeroth. The images themselves were capable of being moved to display everything within range of each sensor. Malygos couldn't help but feel impressed by the ingenuity of the keepers, as connecting so many different scrying tools was by no means an easy feat. "Amazing." Kulkos trailed off as he gazed at the displays with open awe. "Did you make these, Keeper Archidas?" "I did not," Archidas immediately denied. "The discs were the work of Loken and Mamayan." Yes, the discs of Norgannon are indeed a fascinating artifact," Malygos said impatiently as he began to look through the many displays. "If we've all established that, then I would like your assistance in searching for anything strange. Anything that seems out of the ordinary should be brought to my attention." The intelligences built into the sensor network would capture anything big that had happened so long as it occurred within the sensor range. However, the arrival of the Lich King was important enough to warrant a thorough inspection of the sensor displays. Kulkos gaped at him with alarm even as Archidas and Ionaya began sifting through the displays. "Lord Malygos, something like that will take a long time. Has something important happened?" Malygos suddenly remembered that Kulkos had no idea what they were looking for and decided to give the younger dragon a quick explanation. "I and the other aspects have reason to believe that the Burning Legion intends to use an artifact to create an absurdly powerful necromancer and send them to Azeroth to weaken this world and usher in another invasion. We are searching for any sign of this necromancer, who we refer to as the Lich King. They would most likely be sent to an isolated corner of Azeroth to avoid detection and gain power." Kulkos looked even more alarmed now. "What? That sounds horrible, Lord Malygos. How do you know about this?" "None of your business," Malygos said dismissively. Unlike his siblings, he had not told a single person about Krivax or his vision. Not because he cared about the Nerubians' privacy, but because he simply wasn't the type to share secrets without great need. "Just get to work and start looking for anything strange." Malygos was pleased to see that Kulkos didn't feel insulted and merely nodded as he started examining the images. Malygos decided that he would focus first on the Eastern Kingdoms. "Let's see here. Orcs languishing in camps, mortals rebuilding their kingdoms, a troll warlord consolidating power. Nothing really important. Oh, there are several locations in Blackrock's Spire that I can't see. I should look into that when I have the chance. Ragnaros is a problem. But one that can wait until later." "Lord Malygos, why are you focusing on the Eastern Kingdoms?" Kulkos asked after nearly a half hour of searching. "I thought you said that they would be sent somewhere isolated from contact." Malygos hummed thoughtfully. It was a good question, so he didn't mind providing an answer. "That is only the most likely outcome based on what we know. To believe that the Burning Legion could not do otherwise is to lack imagination," Malygos explained even as he continued to search for anomalies. Kil'jaeden could turn one of his Nathrazim into the Lich King and send them to secretly kill and raise the mortal leadership as undead. Or the Legion could have used a ritual to hide a portion of the world from observation prior to the Lich King's arrival by using demons they snuck in through the Dark Portal during the Second War. Or the Lich King could have simply been sent into the ocean, which is vast, isolated, and teeming with life. That last possibility worried Malygos the most. Azshara was very effective in protecting her domain against any attempts to observe it thoroughly, so there was a fear that the Lich King could rise from the depths with an army of undead. The only thing stopping that from happening was Azshara and her servants, who were more than powerful enough to crush the Lich King before they became a threat. Still, Azshara was arrogant and vain enough to believe she could control such a being, and powerful enough to potentially succeed. There was also a small chance that the two could cooperate. The Burning Legion and the Old Gods seemed to be opposing forces, but there were some historical examples of them simply ignoring each other to pursue mutual goals. Such a scenario would be the worst possible outcome for Azeroth. All of those possibilities sound horrible, Lord Malygos, Kulkos said worriedly. Malygos could tell that the younger dragon was trying to hold back his fear as he imagined the results of such outcomes. They do, Malygos agreed as he turned his attention to Kalimdor. Unfortunately, we don't know the full capabilities of the artifact used to create the Lich King, nor do we know how Kil'jaeden intends to send them to Azeroth. With these factors unknown to us, it is difficult to truly predict what might happen. When Krivax told them that Kil'jaeden simply threw the Lich King to Azeroth in a block of ice, Malygos had merely stared at the Nerubian in bewilderment. If the Burning Legion could just turn people into blocks of ice and throw them at Azeroth, why would they need portals in the first place? How accurate was his aim? Were they even actually able to choose where the Lich King would land, or was it a coincidence that they arrived on Northrend in the other timeline? Also, what were the Helm of Domination and Frostmourne? Where did they come from and what abilities did they give? All of these uncertainties made it difficult to be certain of anything, so Malygos was forced to rely on what was most likely. They had to proceed with the assumption that Kil'jaeden could direct the Lich King wherever he wanted and assume that the Lich King's abilities in this timeline would be somewhat similar to that seen by Krivax. Lord Malygos, I think I've noticed something, Kulkos said eagerly. There are a lot of images that aren't showing anything. They all seem to be grouped in the South Sea. Malygos sighed as his initial interest in Kulkos' findings immediately disappeared. Ignore those. There is a large landmass there that is hidden by powerful concealment magic. We are already aware of the situation. Accessing Pandaria was still a problem that Malygos had yet to solve. He had been busy focusing on other matters, so he had not devoted as much effort to the task as he could have. Malygos pushed those thoughts away and hummed in curiosity as he spotted Krivax during his examination of Kalimdor. The Nerubian was currently in diplomatic talks with the leader of the Tauren. He had apparently used the power gifted to him by Alexstrasza to defeat the Centaur and assist the Tauren, something which Malygos approved of. It was pleasant to see his sister's power used proactively instead of being restrained by her self-imposed restrictions. The two of them were discussing trade to equip the Tauren with proper weapons, the logistics of permanent diplomatic contact, and a plan to push the Centaur away from Mulgore. His curiosity satisfied, Malygos continued his search until he was suddenly interrupted by the voice of Ionaya. Lord Malygos, I believe that I have found something of note. Turning to the normally quiet construct, Malygos saw that she was observing the section of displays dedicated to Zandala. More specifically, she was observing a group of mortals along Zandala's northern coasts that should definitely not be there. Are those Pandaren? Malygos asked with obvious befuddlement. What are they doing there? They shouldn't be anywhere but Pandaria. The mortals had obviously only arrived on the island recently, having created a small camp surrounded by large turtles. Malygos was confused as to how this could have happened until he suddenly felt that he was forgetting an important detail. After casting the appropriate memory spell, Malygos couldn't help but let out a string of curses as the spell brought to mind the day Krivax shared the details of his vision. He mentioned something about some Pandaren living on the back of a giant turtle. The Wandering Isle, he called it. Malygos had once actually gone to find the Wandering Isle as a way to verify the veracity of Krivax's prediction. However, he had quickly lost interest and put the place out of mind after doing so. After all, why would Malygos care about a group of useless mortals doing something as ridiculous as floating aimlessly on the back of a turtle? Malygos quickly pictured the creature in his mind and cast his most powerful scrying spell. When the spell failed in a somewhat familiar fashion, he realized that he might have made a mistake. With the clarity of hindsight, it may have been better if Malygos asked for more details about the Wandering Isle. I suppose there's nothing stopping me from doing so now. Lord Malagos, is something wrong? Malagos ignored Kulko's worried voice and made his way back over to the display that showed Krivax and the Tauren chieftain. The Nerubian was unfortunately too far for Malagos to teleport him to Udaman without a ritual, but that didn't mean they couldn't communicate. Focusing on the image Krivax and casting a long-distance telepathy spell of his own creation, Malagos opened a channel of communication between him and the Nerubian. Little prophet, I have questions that you will answer. Malagos watched as Krivax jolted in the middle of his discussion with the Tauren chieftain and began frantically looking around. What the fuck? It is Malagos. I'm speaking to you telepathically, Malagos was kind enough to explain. He knew that mortals could be a bit dense at times. I have important questions about your knowledge that must be answered. I'm literally in the middle of diplomatic negotiations. Krivax telepathically projected to him, even as the Nerubian floundered to explain his outburst to the confused Tauren. I am already aware of that given that I am watching you, Malagos was quick to reassure. I am willing to tolerate your attention being split. Krivax didn't seem to grow any more relaxed, but he did offer an apology to the Tauren and request a short break in their discussions. Once he was free to do so, Krivax turned his attention back to Malagos. Very well, what do you need to ask? Tell me about the Wandering Isle, Malagos responded. Everything that you know about it. Leave out nothing. Malagos could see the confusion in the Nerubian's face before he answered. The Wandering Isle? I don't know any more than what I told you during my first explanation. It's a giant turtle with a bunch of Pandaren living on its back. They left Pandaria because they wanted to see the rest of Azeroth. Malagos already knew all of that, and none of it was particularly helpful. Tell me about the turtle's history, in detail. Well, I'm sure there's a lot about it that I don't know, but I can tell you what I remember, Krivax hesitantly responded. Malagos watched as the Nerubian cast a memory spell. It's a bit vague, but I recall something about a Pandaren named Lu Lang with Wanderlust who found a turtle on a beach a millennia ago and rode it out to sea to explore. The turtle started growing and his descendants started riding on the backs of the turtle too, until it grew large enough to hold a settlement. Stories like this were one of the reasons that Malagos examined everything the Nerubian said through a heavy lens of skepticism. Turtles don't just grow to the size of an island in less than a mere millennia. If that was the case, Azeroth's seas would be filled with such creatures. It's possible that it was the descendant of the turtle wild god, but they were all currently on Zandala. How could their child then find themselves on Pandaria? How ridiculous. However, there was one detail in particular that Malagos needed to examine. What about the Wandering Isle's ability to navigate Pandaria's mist? I recall that you claimed not to know when I first asked, Malagos questioned. It was one of the first questions that he had asked when the overgrown turtle was mentioned. To be more specific, I said that the details were conflicting and ambiguous, Krivax immediately corrected. I know that Lu Lang could pass through the mists when he was alive, but I also remember that the Wandering Isle was separated from Pandaria for a long time. Was that really what the Nerubian had said? After delving into his memories, Malagos realized that it was. After realizing how unusually powerful the magic concealing Pandaria was, he had determined that it was unlikely that a random beast could do what he himself had so much trouble accomplishing. So, he had disregarded it as an unlikely location for the Lich King. That may have been a mistake. You should have been more exact in your wording, Malagos responded angrily. I am expecting the Lich King to arrive on Azeroth at any time, and now I find Pandaren washed up on the shores of Zandala. Do you understand how troublesome it will be if we have to deal with a mobile Lich King? Malagos watched through the display as Krivax reeled back in shock and affront. There was a surprising amount of anger on the Nerubian's face that he likely wouldn't have shown if they were speaking in person. Excuse me? If I had attempted to tell you about the Wandering Isle's history, you would have impatiently dismissed me immediately. It's not fair to blame me when I'm not being included at all in any of your plans. Malagos growled in anger at the Nerubian's disrespect, but he couldn't say that he was truly wrong. Terminating his mental connection with Krivax, Malygos immediately began making his way to the portal room with Kulkos following behind him. He needed to teleport to Zandala and read through the minds of those Pandaren. And if things were as he feared, then accessing Pandaria had just become his first priority. Zul'jin glared at the approaching island chain as his makeshift ship brought him ever closer. The Gurubashi barely knew anything about making proper ships, so he had been forced to hire one from the greedy goblins down south. He didn't care about the gold, as he had gotten plenty during the Second War, but Zul'jin would not be happy if this turned out to be a waste of time. "You are certain these Darkspear got the best witch doctors round these parts?" Zul'jin grumbled to his ever-present lower. "Can't see why we'd be needing aid from cowards hiding out on some far-off islands." "That artifact you took from the Hikari isn't going to purify itself," Janalai said lazily, her voice passing through their connection. "You don't want to know what would happen to us if I tried to subsume that power as it is." Zul'jin grunted in annoyance and looked down into his bag at the artifact in question. He was no witch doctor, but even he could feel the evil radiating from the strange crystal, as dark and red as dried blood. The thing seemed alive in a twisted sense, pulsating with power in rhythm with his heart. According to Janalai, it was nothing more than a receptacle for mojo. A place where the Hikari could store the magic they accumulated with each sacrifice in preparation to summon their god, Hakar the Soulflayer. Zul'jin thought it was a wicked thing that he wanted nothing to do with, but Janalai said a good witch doctor could turn its mojo into something useful. "TCH. These cowards better be worth my time," Zul'jin said, turning his gaze back to the islands. "I spent too long dealing with those Hikari." He had only managed to conquer a few more tribes, all of them around the same size as the Razashi. He was nearly strong enough to move to the larger tribes, like the Blood Scalp and the Skull Splitters, but he still needed just a little more power. The goblins sent Zul'jin off on one of their rowboats once they were close enough to the island. He was traveling alone, as his competent and trustworthy subordinates needed to stay behind to keep things in order. Besides, the tribes he had conquered were still learning who was in charge. This was a good opportunity to see what they would do while he was gone. Zul'jin waded ashore, pulling the goblin rowboat up onto the beach. The tropical heat bore down on him, an annoying contrast to the cooler air of Suleiman. Fortunately, he wouldn't have to travel very far. The islands were small, and it wouldn't be long before he ran into one of the Darkspear. Sure enough, Zul'jin didn't have to wait for long after he delved into the island's small jungle before he noticed a pair of scouts following him. They thought that they were being sneaky, but Zul'jin had been hunting elves through the forests for longer than they had been alive. "If you be thinking of sneaking up on me, you gotta be doing a whole lot better," Zul'jin spoke, his voice cutting through the dense foliage as he turned to the scouts. The two Darkspear scouts, young and barely holding their spears properly, froze as he called them out before standing tall and puffing their chests. "Who are you?" "These islands belong to the Darkspears." Zul'jin scoffed disdainfully at the boy before responding. "I'm not here for you, just your chieftain. Keep your spears down, I ain't got any interest in causing harm." Not yet at least. Such a thing wouldn't have worked with most trolls, but Zul'jin knew what he looked like. The changes Janalai made to him made it obvious to any troll with sense that Zul'jin wasn't someone to take lightly. He could see the boy's eyes trail over his taloned arm and his dragon hawk eyes. Zul'jin breathed out a wisp of fire for emphasis, causing the scouts to flinch back. "Name's Zul'jin," he declared, knowing even so far from Suleiman that his name would be recognized. "Now, take me to your chieftain, before I go see him myself." The scouts both jerked in surprise before wisely agreeing. Zul'jin followed as they led him through the jungle until the trees opened to reveal a bustling village of straw huts and trolls. The village was not nearly as advanced as Suleiman, but he hadn't expected it to be. Still, Zul'jin found himself reluctantly impressed as he was led through the village. Even if they were primitive, it was obvious to him that the trolls living here were happy and well taken care of. The children played happily with one another and looked up at him with curiosity instead of the open suspicion he was expecting. It was a far cry from the children of Zulaman, who lived in a constant state of fear that elven fastriders would pass through their lands and slaughter entire villages. Zul'jin could still remember each and every time that he had found a village living near the edge of Zulaman destroyed by the elves. One of the elves he had captured called it culling and said that their population needed to be kept low so they didn't breed out of control and started getting ideas. It was in that exact moment that Zul'jin knew his people could only live peacefully if the elves of Quel'Thalas were driven far away from troll lands, forever. Zul'jin stewed in these dark thoughts until he was finally brought to Chieftain's hut. It was larger than the others, adorning with the skulls of animals he didn't recognize and various tributes to whichever loa they worshipped. The two scouts nudged open the door and gestured for him to enter. Inside, a troll with a bone necklace and leather robes was sitting cross-legged in front of a cauldron filled with a sickly green liquid. The witch doctor looked up as he entered, and Zul'jin could see that one of his eyes was blind. More worryingly, he was also wearing a rushka, which was a ceremonial mask that could be used to channel the power of a loa. The Darkspear chieftain had obviously been warned of his arrival ahead of time, most likely by a sentry ward, and didn't trust him. Now he was ready for a fight. How vexing. Zul'jin, leader of the Amani. Can't say I ever expected to meet you myself. The name's Sen'jin, chieftain of the Darkspear, said the witch doctor as he continued to stir the cauldron. You don't seem the type to appreciate people speaking in circles, so I'll be blunt. If you want my tribe to get involved with what you're doing in Stranglethorn Vale, you've wasted a trip. We ain't interested. Zul'jin found himself caught off guard. He hadn't expected the troll to deny him before he'd even said a word. Once his shock faded, it was immediately replaced by anger. So, you're just gonna sit pretty on these islands while our kin are getting slaughtered by them elves and humans? While they're starving and struggling cause they've been chased from lands that's rightfully theirs? You just gonna hide away here like a damn coward? Better than join in you, said Sen'jin, his voice calm as if he hadn't just been insulted in his own home. I've seen plenty of warlords like you over the years. You have big dreams of making a troll empire in these lands, but someone like you will fail like all the rest. I can already see that a whole lot of trolls are gonna be dead before somebody puts a knife in you. My tribe won't be among them. The words were said with a finality that Zul'jin didn't expect. He was told that these Darkspear were the type to avoid a fight, yet this witch doctor had reacted with hostility as soon as he entered his hut. What does a safe and snug troll like you know about me and my life? Zul'jin snarled, his patience wearing thin with a sanctimonious old fool. You ever had to look at young'un and tell 'em their ma and pa were killed fetchin' water? You ever been tortured before losing an arm and eye to the enemy? Sen'jin didn't react to his outburst, though he did turn his one-eyed gaze back to Zul'jin and looked him directly in the eyes. I don't need to fight the elves and humans to know they ain't our friends. The Darkspear have fought enough battles in our time and survived. But just surviving ain't enough for you, is it? I can see it in your eyes. Survival is the least of what we deserve. Zul'jin glared at the witch doctor, his anger only growing. We were once kings of this land, revered by all. The elves, the humans, the dwarves, they've taken everything from us. I aim to take it back. If a few trolls got to die to do it, then that's just what it takes. Sen'jin leaned back and sighed, the disdain in his eye slowly being replaced with a pity that only infuriated Zul'jin even further. A noble idea, but your path will only lead to more pain, Zul'jin. Power ain't gonna bring back what's lost. It won't bring peace. Those lands are already lost, and they ain't coming back. Zul'jin studied the witch doctor in front of him and saw that he wouldn't change his mind. He would have already killed the fool normally, but there was still something that he needed from Sen'jin. Reaching into his bag, Zul'jin retrieved the artifact that he had taken from the Hikari. If you're not interested in joining the fight, how about this then? Zul'jin growled through gritted teeth as he brandished the blood-red artifact. Took this from the Hikari. Its mojo is dark, potent, and brimming with power. I've been told that a good witch doctor can turn this thing to something useful. In return, I'll leave you and yours alone to stay on your little islands. Sen'jin stared at the artifact, his eye narrowing with wariness as he sensed the energy emanating from it. That's no small thing. It'll take a whole lot of work to turn that into something that won't drive you mad. Might need to call in some favors. Not sure I want to do that just to give you more power. If you don't, then the consequences will be on your hands if I use it anyway, Zul'jin said, hoping the witch doctor would agree so he could finally leave his presence. Plus I'll be sure to take a ship full of my warriors here the first chance I get. We'll see how you handle things when peace isn't an option. Sen'jin was silent as he mulled over Zul'jin's threat. Eventually, Sen'jin sighed and nodded. I ain't promising nothing, Zul'jin. But I'll look at this thing and see what I can do. Better than you turning into some Haka-shaped monster and rampaging across Stranglethorn Vale. You can stay here for a bit while I look into it. Maybe you'll learn something new. It wasn't the result Zul'jin had wanted when he first came to these islands, but it was good enough for now. Fair enough, Zul'jin replied, his gaze steely as he tossed the artifact to Sen'jin. Just remember, Sen'jin. The elves, the humans, they don't care if you want to fight or not. The Darkspear won't be able to hide forever, and there'll be a day your tribe wished it had friends. With that, Zul'jin turned around and strode out of the hut. He needed some time to calm down, or he was going to bury his axe in the witch doctor's skull. Hidden behind several powerful concealment spells, Tichondrius stood high in the sky atop a platform of hardened fell magic overlooking the battle taking place beneath him. While he was fully capable of flying, he had always found it tedious to do so while staying in a single location. Under a dark and lightning-filled sky, a constant stream of various undead creatures were assaulting a group of surprisingly skilled mortals. The warriors of the so-called Shadowpan were far more capable than the peaceful monks who once lived on the back of Shen Xin Su. These few were exceptionally gifted, having been chosen to guard the Isle of Thunder against any intruders. Unfortunately for them, the Lich King was far beyond what they were prepared to handle. Once this island was chosen for their staging ground against the rest of Pandaria, it had been completely surrounded by a horde of aquatic undead and isolated by preventing the creation of any portals to the mainland. Still, the mortals fought against a foe that they couldn't defeat with surprising bravery. They had fallen back to a small fort and showed every intention of fighting to the last. Tichondrius hummed in approval as he watched a Pandaren dressed entirely in black gracefully jump from his fort's walls and launch herself toward one of the sea giants threatening to destroy the mortal fortifications. Her sword crackled with lightning as she smoothly decapitated the undead giant, ending it in a single blow. While it was possible to reanimate a creature without its head, the magic involved was significantly more complex for a headless torso. The greater the difference between what a body's soul remembered as its form and what it was now, the more difficulty a necromancer would have in animating that soul's corpse. For the vast majority of these disposable undead, such a thing was almost never worth the effort. These mortals had learned that extremely quickly when the undead they were facing ignored any normally fatal wounds to the rest of the body. The surrounding undead immediately attempted to swarm the Shadowpan warrior as she landed, but the warrior was quickly protected by a barrier of light that effectively kept the undead at bay. Tichondrius turned his attention to the mortal responsible, a robed member of the Omnia discipline, a faction of the Shadowpan composed of mages and priests. Without these spellcasters, he was almost certain that the mortal warriors would have already fallen. "Your people are quite impressive," Tichondrius complimented the only other person standing atop his platform. "The mortals of Azeroth have always been truly exceptional. I'm glad to see that hasn't changed since I was last here." When he received no response, Tichondrius chuckled in amusement and turned to look at his unwilling companion. Master Shangzai looked much different in death than he did in life. His fur was a spectral white and his eyes emanated an icy blue glow common among sapient undead. The lantern that had once hung from his curved wooden staff had been replaced by a frost-rimed orb of concentrated necromantic magic. The only thing that looked the same about him was his robes, as the scourge did not yet have the facilities to forge an adequate replacement. Raising the undead monk as more than just an insane ghoul had taken some effort given the damaged state of his corpse, but the mortal had impressed Tichondrius enough for him to see it done. Master Shangzai had proven surprisingly strong-willed, having retained much of his personality and skills after having been risen into undeath. He also never failed to remind Tichondrius about the involuntary nature of his servitude. "Well, I would quite like to hear your thoughts on their performance," Tichondrius prodded, gesturing towards the ongoing conflict. Master Shangzai turned slowly, glaring at Tichondrius with his icy blue gaze. Despite being undead, there was still a spark of life in his eyes, a lingering defiance that Tichondrius found both amusing and intriguing. He could of course squash that rebellious attitude with the slightest effort and ensure the undead monk's undying loyalty to the Lich King, but that would be far too boring. With his fellow Nathrazim off on their own missions, and Gul'dan being as single-mindedly obsessed with power in death as he was in life, Master Shangzai was the only interesting conversational partner Tichondrius could find. "They fight with honor and courage," Master Shangzai finally spoke, his voice a whisper of its former warmth, now laced with a cold undertone. "They bring great honor to their people by fighting to their dying breath against your evil." The monk's words were punctuated by the sight of one of the mortal defenders being dragged down from the wall he was defending into the surrounding undead. He fought valiantly, cutting down swaths of shambling corpses in a flurry of steel, his last breath taken in a defiant roar that echoed across the battlefield. Moments after he died, a massive ball of arcane fire landed on the spot where he fell, destroying a large number of undead and ensuring the warrior could not be raised against his allies. "They certainly learn fast," Tichondrius observed as he studied the magic being used by the mortals. There was only one among them who wielded arcane magic, while a few others used the light and an unusual form of spirit magic. "Tell me, Master Shangzai, do you believe that they will break once the inevitability of their deaths becomes clear? When they begin to grow slow and tired?" Unlike last time, the response from Master Shangzai came instantly. "They will not. They already know that this fight will be their last, but that knowledge will not break them. It will only make them stronger." Tichondrius continued to watch the battle for several more moments. While the mortals were beginning to slow down, there was an elderly monk who was floating in the middle of their fort and exuding spirit-infused mist that constantly healed their wounds and reinvigorated them. "I agree with your assessment, Master Shangzai," said Tichondrius, his mind running through countless scenarios as he considered the implications the strength of these mortals had for his plans. "If our enemies continue to be capable of lasting for so long against our forces, then we will need to face them with overwhelming force." Tichondrius considered simply calling on Gul'dan to destroy these forces. The former warlock was skilled at creating portals and could easily send a group of powerful undead behind their defensive lines, but such a tactic wouldn't always be possible. The front lines of their conquest would often be far beyond the Lich King's reach, so Tichondrius needed to know if the Scourge could operate without direct help. "Our forces are far too uncoordinated without an intelligent undead leading them. Perhaps they'll do better once you take control of them, Master Shangzai," Tichondrius said, eager to see how the undead monk would fare against his former people. "While talented, I'm sure these brave warriors won't last much longer." The undead monk was no great tactician, having lived a mostly peaceful life, but he was fairly skilled with magic and martial arts. Tichondrius watched as Shangzai turned to glare at him with chilling hatred, which he responded to with a sympathetic smile. "Oh, don't look at me like that. You must understand that they're only going to make things harder for themselves if they continue resisting," said Tichondrius, his tone a facsimile of sympathy. "You must know that the Lich King intends to raise such capable warriors as his servants. If their bodies are too badly damaged by the mindless undead, then they will suffer far more than is necessary. Not everyone has your strength of mind, after all. If anything, you'll be doing them a service." Shangzai continued to glare at him for several moments, but eventually jumped down from the platform. He knew that he had no real say in the matter, and Tichondrius' words were not entirely without merit. Undead with badly damaged bodies required more necromantic magic to raise, and mentally suffered from the missing and decomposed body parts. Once he landed amid the undead, Shangzai raised his staff and channeled magic into the orb that hung from it. Moments later, every undead on the battlefield shuddered and momentarily paused as Shangzai took control of them. Tichondrius hummed in approval, gratified that Shangzai had learned from his few lessons on necromancy. With a wave of his staff, Shangzai directed the undead forces with newfound organization and precision. Several sea giants struck at weak points along the fortress, while Naga spellcasters created ramps of ice that allowed undead to easily charge up the walls. Undead Pandaren moved with surprising agility, leaping over the walls and distracting the enemy from being able to mount an effective defense. What had been a slow battle of attrition became a rapid onslaught that caught the mortals off guard. Meanwhile, Shangzai displayed all the skill he had in life and moved through the battlefield like a whirlwind, striking down the defenders while skillfully dodging any magic or projectiles directed at him. Each of his blows was forceful but calculated, ensuring the mortals' bodies remained largely intact even as they fell. From his vantage point, Tichondrius watched as the tide of battle began to turn. The Shadow Pan put up a valiant fight, but their numbers were dwindling and their magic was losing strength. The final blow came when Shangzai managed to maneuver behind enemy lines and slay the elderly monk who had been rejuvenating the defenders. The monk's mist dissipated as her body hit the ground, revealing the true weariness of the Shadow Pan. For the first time since this battle began, Tichondrius could see fear and hopelessness begin to overtake them. It wasn't long before the last of the Shadow Pan fell, succumbing to the relentless undead. Satisfied with the results of this battle, Tichondrius flew down to congratulate his companion on their victory. "Well done, Master Shangzai," Tichondrius said warmly as he landed amidst the fallen mortals. The undead monk ignored him, gazed distant as he stared at his surroundings with an utterly indiscernible expression. "Your tactics were simple but effective, and you've managed to keep their corpses remarkably intact. You should be proud." That finally seemed to be enough to bring Shangzai back to reality as he turned to regard Tichondrius with a seething glare so unlike the once peaceful monk. "Proud? I have brought nothing but disgrace to the memory of my people," Shangzai replied bitterly, his soft voice clear in silence left in the wake of the battle. "These warriors deserve to feel pride in what they have done, but I take no pride in this senseless evil." Tichondrius scoffed, faintly annoyed by the undead's short-sightedness. Despite Shangzai's talents, he was so very young and knew so very little. "Evil? What is that?" Tichondrius drawled dismissively as he swept his eyes over the battlefield. "I have never understood why you mortals so abhor death that you label any force that brings you closer to it as evil. Is it a result of your ignorance as to what comes after? An innate fear of the unknown? Or is it simply because you're all so incredibly attached to your fleeting lives?" Shangzai looked as if he was about to respond, until he suddenly took a deep breath, and his expression returned to the tranquil stoicism that was more characteristic of the monk. "That is simply not something a creature like you would understand," Shangzai replied evenly, his eyes once again growing distant. "The sanctity of life is not something that can be explained through mere words." Tichondrius felt a hint of frustration at the monk's response, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had been alive long before the first mortal came into being on Azeroth. There was nothing of interest that could be learned from these creatures. "Then I see no reason for us to linger," said Tichondrius, turning around and striding away from the battlefield. "Our scouts should by now have combed through this Isle of Thunder. It's a wellspring of untapped power and I find myself impatient to unearth its secrets." After a moment, Tichondrius felt Shangzai begin to follow him, and he allowed his mind to other matters. When the Scourge had first passed through the concealment magic protecting Pandaria several months ago, they had not attacked immediately. Tichondrius had first ordered the oceans surrounding the land to be filled with undead, destroying and raising any natural sea life that once existed around the continent. Then, he had instructed the Naga to begin constructing underwater fortifications while Tichondrius began gathering more information about the land and the mortals living on it. The Burning Legion had not been aware that these lands existed before Shen Zin-Su was raised into undeath, so Tichondrius obviously knew little about it. With the ability to shapeshift and search through memories, it had fortunately not taken very long before Tichondrius knew all that he needed to know about Pandaria. After the collapse of the Pandaren Empire, the mortals of these lands had a highly decentralized government and no standing army. Instead, they were protected by 4 powerful wild gods that they referred to as the August Celestials and a small but elite fighting force called the Shadow Pan. The only true threat to their safety was a race of old god-worshipping insectoid creatures called the Mantid. With this in mind, Tichondrius had decided that the best course of action would be for the Scourge to focus its attention on the Pandaren. While the August Celestials were worthy of caution, defeating the Mantid would likely take the Scourge years of effort. Time that they did not have. Instead, it would be far more effective for them to simply accumulate their forces by destroying coastal settlements. There were plenty of islands surrounding Pandaria's mainland, so there were many vulnerable mortals waiting to be welcomed into the ranks of the Scourge. Mal'Ganis had volunteered to lead that effort, and he was having considerable success. Meanwhile, Tichondrius had taken the Lich King and Shen Zin-Su to find a more appropriate location where they could construct a staging point above land, eventually settling on the Isle of Thunder. Tichondrius glanced upward to the island's namesake. As far as he could see, the sky was engulfed in a perpetual storm as magical lightning danced across the clouds. Tichondrius felt a hint of respect toward the one who created the impressive magical phenomena and once ruled this island. "Tell me more about this Lei Shen," Tichondrius ordered his companion as they walked past a group of skeletons patrolling the island for survivors. This level of power is not something that should be achievable by a mere mortal without falling under the service of a greater being. Azeroth was truly a unique world, with absurdly powerful beings hiding behind every corner. Tichondrius could easily see why the Legion was so obsessed with conquering it. "You already know as much as I do of the Thunder King," Shangzai said reluctantly, forced to speak against his will after being given a direct order. Tichondrius had already known that was likely to be the case, but he still found himself disappointed. Most Pandaren only knew about Lei Shen through vague legends. The only ones who might know more would be the leaders of the Shadow Pain, but Tichondrius did not currently have the means to capture and interrogate them. "A pity," Tichondrius said as they approached their destination. An undead Naga sea which was directing a group of undead in the construction of a large pillar infused with a combination of fell and arcane magic. "I would very much like to know if the legends are true and that this Lei Shen left behind a body. He would definitely make for a useful soldier of the Scourge." Tichondrius would normally worry about losing control of such a powerful undead, but the Lich King would need to be either destroyed or extremely injured for anyone to escape his control. Shangzai seemed to startle at the thought, but otherwise kept his thoughts to himself. As Tichondrius approached, the Sea Witch spotted him and ceased her commands before bowing deeply. "Lord Tichondrius," she greeted, her 4 arms crossing over her chest in a gesture of respect. "Construction is progressing as scheduled. The pylon will soon be ready to tap into this island's leyline nexus." Tichondrius nodded in approval. It was important that the Scourge establish robust magical defenses around this place before any powerful entities managed to rally against them. He did not yet know how powerful the August Celestials were, but if they were anything like the wild gods who took part in the War of the Ancient, then some amount of caution was warranted. "Excellent work, Tide Mistress Narkis," Tichondrius responded as he surveyed the pylon appreciatively. "What progress have the scouts made in surveying the island's interior?" The undead Naga swayed slightly on her serpentine lower half as she rose from her bowed position. "Progress has been steady, and we have already located many points of interest. This place will serve as an excellent stage for the Scourge's future conquests. To the west is a large graveyard full of the bodies of this island's former rulers. To the north is a mine filled with lightning-infused ore, along with a well-constructed forge built atop Titan machinery." Tichondrius couldn't help but be surprised. He had already predicted that the Isle of Thunder would serve as an excellent staging ground given that it was once Lei Shen's seat of power, but this was even better than he had expected. "Send every necromancer we have to begin raising the dead in that graveyard," Tichondrius ordered, his mind racing with the implications of their discovery. "The mortals who were buried there are guaranteed to know far more about this island than we do. Acquiring their knowledge is a priority. I will examine the forge myself. That is far too important a task to leave in the hands of someone less capable." Tichondrius knew far less about forges than those of his kin who worked at the cursed forge of the Nathrazim, but what little he knew would be more than any of these undead. "Yes, Lord Tichondrius. Your orders will be carried out immediately." Narkis bowed her head once more and gestured for one of her Naga attendants to relay the command. "Good. What have we learned about the Throne of Thunder?" Tichondrius asked as he glanced toward the massive palace to the north. The structure rose high into the stormy sky and was adorned with several pylons that crackled constantly with lightning. "Securing it will be essential if we wish to take full control of this island." If Titan machinery was buried nearby, Lei Shen's palace had become the highest priority for Tichondrius. Those buried machines gave him a significant hint as to the source of the mortal's power. That is somewhat more difficult, Lord Tichondrius," Narkis responded, her voice carrying a hint of hesitation. "The palace appears to be under the protection of potent wards. It is also being guarded by a large serpentine creature that can fly through the air and call upon lightning." Somewhat curious, Tichondrius decided to cast a scrying spell over the Throne of Thunder. While he couldn't see within its interior, it didn't take very long for him to spot the creature in question. He was greeted to the sight of a massive cloud serpent, more than 100 feet in length and covered in blue scales that crackled with lightning. It took Tichondrius a moment to sort through the local legends and recognize it as Nalak the Storm Lord, Lei Shen's personal mount. "I see," said Tichondrius, surprised by the power radiating from the beast as it patrolled the palace. "I will have to handle this creature myself." The scourge only had a few smaller undead cloud serpents and Coatl that were capable of flight, and especially didn't have ones capable of defeating such a powerful beast. It would be very useful for future battles once Tichondrius had slain it. However, it would probably be wise to enlist the assistance of Mal'Ganis first. He had long since learned that recklessness came with unpredictable consequences. It was fortunate that Tichondrius already planned to contact Mal'Ganis and the three brothers to discuss the progress of their respective missions anyway. "Shangzai, you're free to do as you like," Tichondrius said, glancing toward the monk. While he was confident in the magic controlling Shangzai, there were things not meant for outsiders to hear. "I suggest you spend that time helping the mortals you killed adjust to their new circumstances. I'm told undeath can be quite disorientating initially. Perhaps your guidance could ease their transition." Shangzai simply nodded serenely and began making his way back to the recently killed Pandaren. As he walked away, Tichondrius couldn't help but muse over the undead's mental resilience. Not only Shangzai, but many of the monks had displayed an abnormal ability to control themselves despite the effects that necromantic magic often had on mortals and their emotions. It was a factor that he would be keeping a very close eye on. With a few beats of his wings, Tichondrius lifted off into the air and started flying toward the southern coast. That had been chosen as the best place for Shen Xinsu to be stationed. From that direction, undead were constantly streaming out over the island and converting it into a scourge stronghold. It wasn't long before Tichondrius caught sight of the gargantuan figure of Shen Xinsu. The barrier surrounding its shell had been lowered, revealing the turtle's entire shell to be covered in thick layers of ice and an army of undead. There were also several runes carved into the creature that glowed brightly with a mixture of fel and death magic. Ignoring the feeling of Gul'dan watching him closely, Tichondrius continued flying until he reached the Temple of Five Dawns at its center and began making his way to the top of the structure. The temple had become the center of his operations, and he only allowed the most useful undead to enter. After entering the largest room of the temple, once belonging to Master Shangzai, Tichondrius closed the door behind him and began casting wards to protect against any listeners. He chuckled as he felt a wave of frustration come from the Lich King. Once that was done, Tichondrius reached into empty space and opened a small portal from which he retrieved a shimmering fell crystal and quickly cast the spell to activate it. Tichondrius waited as the crystal floated to the center of the room and began pulsing softly. There was no telling if his fellow Nathrazim were currently in a location where they could afford to have a conversation, so it was best to be patient. Several minutes later, the crystal suddenly flared brightly and the image of Varimathras appeared in midair. The two of them didn't bother to exchange any greetings as they waited for the rest of their kin. Balnazar was the next to appear, wearing the guise of Troll Witch Doctor, while Ditharokand Mal'Ganis responded soon after. Seeing no reason to delay, Tichondrius began the meeting the moment that the last of them responded to the scrying spell. The Scourge has successfully taken control of the Isle of Thunder. The only resistance of note was a small garrison of Shadow Pan warriors. Tichondrius spent the next few minutes reporting the details of his mission. The result was as expected, so none of his fellow Nathrazim showed any kind of reaction until he mentioned the Titan machinery and the beast guarding the Throne of Thunder. Given the circumstances, I believe it is best that you return as quickly as possible, Tichondrius said as he concluded his report, turning his attention to Mal'Ganis. Are you in a position to do so? Have you completed your mission? Mal'Ganis nodded in affirmation, his expression more subdued than Tichondrius had expected. I have. The Pandaren have begun retreating away from the coasts, and the Scourge has developed a significant presence in the Krayzarang wilds. I also managed to discover an island of cloud serpents along the eastern coast of Pandaria. Unfortunately, I was confronted by one of the local wild gods before I could kill and raise them. Tichondrius was not particularly surprised to hear that. They had decided to act overtly as they didn't have time to use more subtle methods with the threat of the aspects always present. The natural consequence of that was that they would quickly attract the attention of the local powers. And? How powerful was it? Tichondrius asked, eager to hear an estimate of the wild god's power. Very, Mal'Ganis admitted, his eyes narrow. The one that came for me was Yulon, the jade serpent. The Pandaren must have been worshipping these august celestials for quite some time, because the creature was significantly more formidable than I expected. Not as much as Malorn, but certainly as powerful as many of the other wild gods we faced during the War of the Ancients. Tichondrius' lips curled into a thoughtful frown at Mal'Ganis' warning. He had no doubt that the Scourge would easily be able to sweep over the Pandaren on their own, but such powerful guardians would complicate things significantly. Tichondrius didn't know how long it would take the aspects to discover their location and find a path through the concealment magic around Pandaria, but he doubted that it would take years. The Scourge had still not yet grown powerful enough to face the combined might of the aspects head-on. Very well, Tichondrius said as he rearranged some of his plans to take into account this new information. Come to the Isle of Thunder as quickly as possible. Perhaps Lei Shen left behind some useful artifacts within his palace that we can use. If not, then we will simply have to find another way to deal with these troublesome wild gods. Mal'Ganis nodded in agreement as Tichondrius turned his attention to Varimathras. Azul-Nerub was one of the most powerful mortal kingdoms that they would eventually need to confront, so Varimathras' mission to sow chaos on Northrend was of great importance. I'm afraid that Mal'Ganis is not the only one who has run into complications, said Varimathras, his voice carrying a hint of frustration. I have researched the Nerubian defenses around the Vrykul who are in stasis and found them to be robust. Even if the Vrykul were to be awoken, Azul-Nerub has many magical and biological weapons stationed nearby to kill large swaths of them as soon as they do. Tichondrius could feel his frown deepen as he was given even more unfavorable news. The Nerubians operated with a degree of competence and ruthlessness that he could admire, if it wasn't causing him so many problems. Fortunately, I believe that I may have found a viable alternative in the Drakari, said Varimathras, his frustration disappearing as he smirked slyly. There are more Vrykul than the ones who exist on Northrend, and I've heard legends that many of their souls pass on to a goddess of death. After some investigation, I believe that this entity could be the answer to many of our problems. Tichondrius listened as Varimathras told him of Helia and her Kuldir. Such a being would make for a powerful ally, and they both had much to gain from cooperation. Very well. Travel to the Broken Isles and attempt to make contact with this entity, Tichondrius commanded. It would likely take Varimathras some time to find Helia, which only made things more difficult. Do so as quickly as possible. We cannot afford to wait long before moving on to the next stage of our plans. Tichondrius turned his attention next to Balnazar, who was still wearing the guise of a troll witch doctor. Balnazar had always been a typical Nathrazim, preferring to cause chaos among enemy ranks while working from the shadows. I have identified 2 paths through which I can weaken the Eastern Kingdoms, Balnazar began, his voice even and businesslike. I initially considered instigating a conflict between Ironforge and the Dark Iron Dwarves, but found there to be too much void influence in Black Rock Mountain for my comfort. That was no great surprise. The Burning Legion already knew that Ragnaros the Firelord resided within Blackrock Mountain and was under the influence of the old gods. The degree of that influence was not known, but it must be significant if Balnazar decided against approaching the Firelord's domain. I then decided to investigate the Gurubashi and discovered that I arrived at a fortunate time, Balnazar continued, his eyes glinting in satisfaction. A powerful troll warlord has begun consolidating power in Stranglethorn Vale. It should not be difficult for me to ensure his success and guide him in a way that furthers our own interests. And how long will this take you? Asked Tichondrius. A troll warlord waging war across the Eastern Kingdoms would be useful for weakening future opposition, but it did little to help them in the short term. Not too long, Balnazar assured, realizing the need for swift action. The warlord in question has become notably more powerful after returning from some journey out to sea. It won't be long now before they move against the remaining Gurubashi tribes. I will ensure he succeeds. That was indeed good news, but Tichondrius doubted that the aspects would allow themselves to be distracted by mere trolls. His initial plan had been for the 3 brothers to enact their plans somewhat simultaneously for maximum effect, but it seemed that would not be possible. Tichondrius needed to cause a significant enough threat now while Gul'dan was still developing his forces. If the defenders of Azeroth were to confront the Scourge now, the best-case scenario was that they would be able to retreat and disappear into the vast ocean to rebuild once more. The most likely scenario was that the aspects would simply obliterate them before they were allowed to do so. With these factors in mind, Tichondrius turned his attention to the only Nathrazim who had yet to deliver his report. Are you in position? Ditherok nodded in affirmation. Indeed. There is no sign that Southern Ferelars is being monitored closely by anyone. The only noteworthy development on Kalimdor is the Tauren successfully pushing the Centaur back west over the past few months with the help of the Nerubian I mentioned in my previous report. That a Nerubian had been blessed by an aspect was definitely something Tichondrius intended to learn more about when he had the opportunity. Coupled with its proximity to one of the great trees leading to the Emerald Dream, I believe that this is the perfect place for us to carry out our plan, Ditherok continued. Then do so, Tichondrius said decisively. He had intended to wait longer, but it seemed that circumstances were forcing his hand. Then I will begin immediately, said Ditherok, his figure disappearing as he closed his connection to the fell crystal. With nothing further to discuss, Balnazar, Mal'Ganis, and Ditherok broke off the connection soon after, leaving Tichondrius alone with his thoughts. The leader of the Nathrazim found his mind racing as he tried to estimate how much time this scheme would afford them. Even in the worst-case scenario, the Green Dragonflight would be far too busy to threaten the Scourge. However, the best-case scenario would see the Kaldawai Empire facing a threat beyond any they had encountered since the War of the Ancients. Ditherok stored his fell crystal away the moment he finished speaking to his colleagues. Toward the end of their meeting, Tichondrius had shown an urgency for action that he couldn't disagree with. Azeroth was far more prepared to deal with the Lich King than they had ever imagined, and it was severely affecting their plans. Nathrazim were not ones to lean towards sudden and dramatic actions, but they had to change the situation if they were to succeed. Crouching down, Ditherok began to unlock and open the fell iron container that had been personally enchanted by Lord Kil'jaeden. The magic surrounding it ensured that its contents could not spread beyond its borders. Reaching inside, Dithierok retrieved a large, blooming flower that radiated an enormous amount of life and fell magic in equal measure. Dithierok let out a sigh of admiration as he studied the flower, even as it threatened to burn his flesh and burrow roots beneath his skin. The evergrowth of Draenor must have once been a truly terrifying entity, a collective hive mind of that world's plant life. The Horde had killed the last of the Genesaurs, the immense plant-like beings that once roamed Draenor, but Kil'jaeden had been able to harvest their corpses in order to create the flower that he now held in his hands. Now that the flower was infused with fell magic and enhanced with the most powerful rituals that the Burning Legion could muster, Dithierok was eager to see what kind of threat it would pose to Azeroth. Seeing no reason for further delay, Dithierok slowly planted the flower into the ground beneath him and watched eagerly as it immediately began to spread.